good afternoon, good morning, good evening to wherever you are in the world. My name's Nicholas Jeffery. As Susanna kindly said, I am the Chief Executive and Founding Partner of Impresario, and I'm also the Chief Executive of HBBA, the Canadian group. And we've got quite a large contingent on the call from Canada today, which will be a passionate discussion about tariffs and the relationship with their near close neighbours. How I'd like to engage with you on this call of little over an hour, we've invited several masters of the art of commercial migration. And we've created a series of fireside chats, one-on-one, that we'll welcome you to participate in. And I'm going to ask a few searching questions, provocative questions, to get each guest to tease out some real actionable insights to help us find some competitive and sustainable advantage and avoid some of the bear traps that the US administration are trying to set for us all. I'll open it up to a few questions after each session. There could be a bit more and there could be a few more at the end, but we'll have a time to circle back round and cover off many questions you can. Everybody will go on mute, but do raise your electronic hand if you have a question and it will pop up and I will see it really easily. Either myself or Sean or Susanna will actually pick up that question, but just raise your electronic hand if you want to. And also what I'd like to suggest is you post your details into the chat. If you can open up the chat so everybody can post their details in, it's a really good way to interact with people. Obviously, LinkedIn is probably the platform of choice that we should all be using. But if you put your details in there, your name, your company, your location, and also what you're after trying to find out about or where you're trying to interact, that's really quite useful so that people can see that I'm trying to get hold of Mary and I want to talk to Mary about funding in Brazil. And it's really useful just to put that one line in. So let's move on to, this is session 2. We cut our teeth on session 1, had a great recording. This is going to be called the silent reordering, trade, power, and the new corridors of influence. So again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the colleagues and partners from around the world. What I'd like you to do is step back with me, away from the stock ticker tape pricing and the X scroll or Twitter scroll, depending how ancient you are, and to step back from all the turbulence and look more deeply at what is quietly unfolding across the global trade landscape. We're not merely experiencing a trade dispute. We're witnessing a fundamental redrawing of the economic map. And it doesn't matter whether you're a small office, home office trying to grow or a medium-sized enterprise trying to grow. I promise you it will affect you, and we'll give you some really interesting anecdotes of how it even affects a small enterprise like Impresario. But it's moving so quickly that a month gap between our fireside chat just doesn't seem to do the momentum justice. Because at least you could say in the first 100 days, Donald Trump has achieved more disruption in his first 100 days than any other president known to the US. And we've also had a general election in Canada, and there's been some very interesting backstories appearing there, and we wanted to share these with you. And Canada being a focus of one of our countries is fairly important. So to make it easy to understand what's happening, and more importantly, what we can do about it, for our 4 invited guests, they're going to join me on these virtual fireside chats, and we'll unravel what's going on and work out how individually we can make lemonade when the world is giving us lemons. So I see where we are now as part of a 5-part play unfolding in front of our very eyes. And the first act is what I'm calling the strategic withdrawal. On our first call, on the first Tuesday of April, we examined the rationale behind the tariffs, which at first glance appeared to be electoral theatre. But on closer inspection, they reflected something deeper. It was a recognition of the internal fiscal fragility of the US. and the administration's desire to slow or reverse economic overdependence on global linkages, and ultimately to force the Federal Reserve, into an interest rate cut. Because if you get an interest rate cut in the US, all sorts of benefits happen. Exports become cheaper, mortgages become cheaper. The leader of the Fed is fighting Trump because he doesn't want to reduce them so quickly, because he's nervous about what is the ultimate impact of the tariff. So you've got this yin and yang, left brain, right brain, whatever you want to talk it, between the Fed and the administration in terms of exactly the progress in the US. But now one question looms larger than all others. In my opinion, that's what's the long-term consequence of a sustained economic disengagement between the United States and China? And what will happen to Christmas? But more to come on that later. So let's link back to the first chat. My hypothesis, and it's not well versed, which either means I'm completely wrong or I'm smart, I'm not really quite sure. But my hypothesis was, why is the US administration forced to do this? Remember, it's all about the financing of the $9 trillion in maturing treasury bonds. Now, if China and now Canada quietly begins to sell off its holdings of US Treasury bonds as a response to the ongoing tariff pressures, it could ultimately trigger a ripple effect across the American economy. And as one of the largest foreign holders of US debt, China's divestment would likely drive down the bond prices, push up the yields, making it almost impossible for the US to refinance its debt in a year 2026. So if you remember, the 9 trillion was taken out 10 years ago at just over 1% interest rates. The long-term treasury bonds are now trading at 4.6%. So if you have to borrow the same 9 trillion again, it's going to cost you a lot more money. So if he can drive down the overheads of the US, a la Elon Musk, quickly, he's got to do it in a year and get rid of all the debt out of the way, and reduce the debt and increase the interest rate, or reduce the interest rates from the Fed, he can then make the US in better shape than it is today. But he's only got a year to do it. So if the Chinese and now the Canadians start to sell off some of their treasury bonds, it complicates the effort to manage the already ballooning national debt that could force the Federal Reserve to actually intervene more aggressively and push the interest rates higher, which will dampen the investment faster, slower the housing market faster, and place greater pressures on the consumer. So this could all be ending up in a geopolitical standoff and turning domestic economic headwinds against the US. So I believe the answer lies not in the visible noise of policy announcements, banging of table and things like that, but the subtler movements of capital, supply chains, and what I like to call statecraft. Kissinger used to call it statecraft. So the once dominant logic of global integration, the global economy, is no longer sacrosanct. And ideological divides and demographic shifts and even national interest are reasserting themselves. Not always with fire and fury, but with steady, calculated resolve. Carney bought government bonds 2 days after tariffs. 2 days. So he was buying a mechanism downstream that he knew he would be able to use. So, as Rob so beautifully put it just before we started our call, one day Canada was being quoted as being the next state of the US, and they had no idea and authority over themselves. One call later, when I'm sure Carney let the US government know that he was controlling almost 7% of the US debt, all of a sudden he was actually quoted as being quite a sensible and quite a nice man. So I think this statesmanship is going to affect what's going on, but hold on to your seats because this is going to change dramatically. Because this is not decoupling in a dramatic sense, but it's what I'm calling selective disengagement, and it's being strategically applied. And even a small company or as a mid-cap company needs to keep an eye on what's going on. So yesterday, the US moved ahead with 104% Chinese tariffs, effectively yesterday midday. That's pretty much disastrous worst case scenario for markets in the near term. The S&P, Standard & Poor's exchange of 500 companies lost 5.83 trillion in market value. Its steepest drop, 4-day losses since the index was created in the 1950s. Okay, so where we are now is that even if earnings in the first quarter, because they're beginning to come out now, aren't badly down, we're going to see a lot of language from companies about expected impact from the tariffs that will impact the US and us globally. So going on to Act Two, I believe that we should be looking for new corridors, old lessons. When we started this project about a month ago, we talked to somebody in the lumber industry in Canada who was almost in meltdown because he now didn't have his market without the tariffs to go to the US. And we talked about moving lumber sales to Europe. And he said, absolutely no way. There's no point doing that because the UK has excess lumber and it then sells it to the US. And I'm going, no, the UK doesn't have export lumber. It's a massive importer of lumber. And this individual running quite a large corporation had just not done his homework and he had got comfortable, stroke servicing the US. The US market dried up overnight because of costs, and he hadn't really thought and prepared to look everywhere else. So I'm saying in history, as market vacuums disappear or markets disappear, vacuums get created, but they don't remain unfilled for very long. So when you have the withdrawal of one actor, invariably it creates space for others to step forward. Look at Africa since US aid has uncoupled. China's moved in a more dramatic sense, and now the UAE and the Gulf states have moved in as well. You look at the new economic drawing of Africa, and it's red, and it's the Gulf states. So in this new emerging world, we see what I would call the rise of corridors of convergence. They're more than logistic routes, they're more than statements of intent, and they're being signed now. So the corridors that I would suggest that we all need to start looking at there's 4 of them. One is the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. Luckily, it's got an acronym, which is called IMEC, IMEC. And it's a logistical artery designed not merely to enhance trade efficiency, but to reorient geopolitical connectivity away from traditional choke points. And a lot of people are looking at that. There's another one called the China-Africa Zero Tariff Initiative. So when the US dropped tariffs on Africa, China released them. So there are now 33 African nations that now enjoy full access to the Chinese market with zero tariff. It's not aid, it's architecture. The resurgence of Mexico as a manufacturing alternative with its proximity to the US and new strategic relevance is shaping the hemisphere trade partners. So even though Mexico has big tariffs from the US, it's still close and it's got better tariffs than China. So getting goods from China to Mexico and then Mexico into the US, as Rob will explain to us in a little while, might be interesting. The last one is this Central Asian Middle Corridor. It's an ancient route, and I've done quite a bit of business there. It's an ancient route reimagined for a post-Russian world, and it threads between China, Kazakhstan, the Caucasus, and into Europe. It's the old Silk Route with Tashkent in the middle of it and Samarkand in the middle of it. So each of these new corridors reflect a recalibration of a new worldview. They're not formatted in isolation, but it's the connected tissue of a new, what I would call a multipolar order, in which alignment is defined by resilience, not allegiance, and it requires us to be more agile. The third act is this calculus of contingency. In these times, strategic ambiguity can be a national asset. You can go from 0% tariffs to 50% tariffs to 146% tariffs, back down to 10 and back up to 110. And you can do that in the space of a month. But for business leaders like us, ambiguity without preparedness becomes perilous, because we don't know if we can import, because by the time it hits where we want it to be, the tariffs could be 10 times more than we imagined. So what I want to do is actually help us understand exactly how we can work within these tariff tensions. So let's not forget, this is Act 4. So let's not forget that trade is not merely the exchange of goods. It's an expression of values of influence and power. So when the United States and China reduce engagement, we must recognize that the result is not simply a gap. It's a rebalancing act, almost like sending ripples across waters when you throw in a rock in the middle. This opens the field for nations previously sidelined to become more agile, more informed, and more connected. So I know we have a lot of people on from Hungary, so this is not a political statement, and I'm living here and a resident here, but look at Prime Minister Orban. His maneuvering with China and with Trump and with Russia and with Europe might be a dire repeat of Hungarian geopolitical maneuvering throughout history, or it might be really smart. Only time is going to tell, but that's what I'm saying. If you're in Hungary looking to export, you're looking at it at the moment going, hold on, should I go east off to China because that looks really good? Or should I go off to the US? Oh, hold on, I can't really do that because Hungary's got the same tariffs because it is part of Europe. You've got to understand these ripples and understand what's going on and speak to as many people and groups like this to understand what your next step is. So in this mild chaos and complexity, there is advantage. And the most successful enterprise will be those that interpret change before it's obvious. Engage with diplomacy as much as distribution, and recognize that in this moment of commercial decisions, they're also geopolitical acts. Now, we'll circle back round to talk about exactly what can you do now in terms of trading beyond tariffs, and we've got some ideas for the UK and for Canada and for Hungary. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to move towards our fireside chats, because what I've just explained is almost like a 40,000 foot view, and that's not what we need. although it's interesting and though it's a provocative conversation, we need to talk at ground level to understand what is the impact, so that your trade strategy can no longer be in your 5-year plan. It has to live in your next board meeting. It has to live in your next hire, and it definitely has to live in your next shipment. So what we've done is we've collected a group of 4 individuals for our fireside chats. And I'm delighted to invite some really well-connected people. Some I haven't known for very long, some I've known for a long time. And these are subject matter experts in their field to sit with me and have a fireside chat, but we want you to participate in it. So we'll pause for questions at the end of each chat. So you can put up your little electronic handshake if you have a question, and we'll pick that up. And then I'll go on to the next. And if you want to hold your questions until after the event, link in to everybody that you need to. If you want to hold them to the end, we'll come back round and we can pick them up again.